I've only told about 5 people this story, but wanted to share it with other like-minded people to try to understand this experience better. So this all took place in 2016 to 2017 in central Georgia, about 45 minutes from Macon. I've always been fascinated with the paranormal and have had countless experiences from my childhood. So I was hanging out with my friends when this topic comes up. Of course, most of my other friends are very skeptical, and I suggested we go somewhere haunted. There is a local legend here about a road with 5 bridges. Ironically, it's called Three Bridges Road to locals, and I told my friends we should check it out. We get there about 1 a.m. and stay a couple of hours. There were a few strange sounds we heard and a dark, heavy feeling, but not much else. One of my friends claims that he saw a woman, but nobody else did, so we figured it was just his imagination. After we are done with the bridges, we go to the church that's right beside them. Now this church is, to put it plainly, weird and creepy. It had blacked out windows, no steeple, and a small cemetery with graves that date back to the 1790s. We get a much stronger feeling here and decide to head back to my buddy's camper and chill. Fast forward a couple of days, and one of my friends, Gunther, claims that he's been seeing a tar lady, as he claimed her ever since we did our little ghost hunting trip. So me, trying to help him feel better, decide to cleanse his camper. Mind you, I've never done this before, so I just start saying, "Any negative entity, I command you to leave. You are not welcome here." And I say it over and over. After about 3 minutes, I feel an immense pressure and weight, like carrying a 100 pounds book bag or something. The lights start to flicker, but I keep on. My friend tells me that there are entities pointing at me, laughing and mocking. I don't see anything, so I continue for about 10 minutes until it's too much to bear. I run outside and start puking, and my friend tells me I have dark circles around my eyes. I feel like I had the worst hangover in history. I tell him I have to leave and go back home. I feel okay the next day, so we ask another friend, Rick, who didn't go with us the first time, for help. He is a pagan and is really knowledgeable on the occult and supernatural lore. We go back to the church, and he looks around for a minute and just says, "This isn't hallowed ground." We ask what he's talking about, and he says that a church should be on hallowed ground, and especially cemeteries. He implies that something weird is going on, and that he suspects that the people of this church might be practicing dark arts. I'm pretty nervous at this, and me and my friend Gunther look at each other. Rick then says that he can help Gunther, and they go back to the camper alone. The next day I check up on Gunther, and he says he's alright now, that Rick gave him something that will protect him. I asked him what it was, and he said it's a demon lord that Rick had a contract with. Gunther said he had to accept the demon and did. I was very skeptical and pretty much thought they were full of crap. Over the course of the next few weeks, I would be hanging out with Gunther and his demeanor would completely change. He isn't dumb or anything, but he is simple and speaks plainly. When this thing would take over, he would speak very articulate and sophisticated. He also wouldn't say "I" when speaking about himself. He would say "Gunther." So I tested this theory by asking it to prove that it was real and not just imagination gone wild or maybe split personalities. It told me a traumatic event I witnessed as a child that I sure didn't tell anyone because my mind tried to erase it. When it said this, I was filled with uncomfortable rage, and my other friends had to stop me from hitting him. All the while, this thing in my friend had a huge grin on its face. After I calmed down, I asked different questions, and it confirmed it was a demon lord. It told me how Gunther's step-grandma was using witchcraft, and about the cult at the church trying to open a portal. The only time I made it angry was when I was helping a friend, Tiffany, who had a negative entity attached to her. The demon was with us, and we had 2 candles lit. I started saying a prayer over Tiffany to get the evil spirit out. She was screaming in pain, and her back arched backwards in a sickening way. The demon lord was saying a chant under his breath the whole time, with his eyes completely closed. After the entity was out of her, I used the opportunity to move my hand and intention to my friend Gunther, who still had his eyes closed and kept saying the same prayer. His eyes shot open immediately, and the look he had was pure hatred. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Don't mess with me," then grabbed both candles and blew them out simultaneously. I have a lot of other stories about this demon lord and of other unrelated paranormal experiences, but this is the one that will always be the creepiest. Let me know if you guys would like to hear more. On a side note, we went to the church one night on Halloween, and at 3 a.m. at a supposed Christian church, there were people in a back room of the church huddled in a circle with a table and piece of cloth etched with symbols in the center. We ran out of there as fast as we could that night. For 12 years, I've worked as an actor for a local haunted house attraction. It's a lot of fun, as I get to play a variety of horror characters and act out different scenes. While the tours we put on are clearly fake, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that isn't. I should start off by explaining that the building we do this out of is extremely old and was once an elementary school. We gutted this section of the building that was classrooms and constructed it to what we needed. This is when we actually started having weird experiences. There's plenty of activity that can be shrugged off, such as feeling watched and hearing footsteps running in areas that there is no one. Then there are things not so easy to disregard, such as one evening, a member was working on hooking up our sound system by himself. He had not even hooked the large speakers up yet when he started to hear a loud, deep growl that came booming through them. This terrified him so much that he ran out of the building and would not go back in, even to lock up, until another member came down to go in with him. He never worked alone in the building again. Other activities seems playful and childlike, such as hearing small giggles and whispering in the halls and in rooms that are empty, things being moved from where we last placed them, etc. One year, I was in a rocking chair that I would jump out of as a group came through. The thing about the rocking chair is it was more like a glider and it was broken. I would have to use a lot of force to get the chair to rock backwards at all. It was right before showtime. I was sitting in this broken chair, getting mentally pumped for the night ahead. I was completely alone when I felt someone grab onto the back of the chair and harshly pull it backwards. I felt myself flying backwards with the chair, and I honestly thought I would flip out of it. Thankfully, this did not happen, and as soon as I stabled myself, I jerked to see who had done this. The room I was in was large, and no one could get out of this room without me seeing them running away in the split second it took to look behind me. There was absolutely no one there, and I suddenly covered in goosebumps. No one was even in the area around my room at this time. Later that same night, the lights were off, my stove was on, and a group had just left my room when I noticed a small figure in the far right corner of the room. It looked like a small child crouching down, looking my way, and I was immediately worried that a child had been left behind from the previous group. As I headed towards the figure to ask if they were okay, the strobe flashed and the figure was completely gone. The same year but different night, I was again sitting in my chair, waiting for the next group when someone or something growled right into my ear. It was so loud that it caused my ear to ring, and when I turned to see what it was, there was nothing but an empty room. I changed rooms the next year and did not experience as much creepy phenomenon. There's not much history I've been able to find out about the building, but I'm so curious as to what could be causing all the weirdness. There's only a tiny bit of what I have experienced over the years working there, and I don't feel it will be stopping anytime soon. So, today is Sunday, a day I usually go to hike a route I've hiked many, many times. I don't anymore, but I had to think of it today. This experience is roughly 2.5 years old now, and I haven't gone back to my old routine since then. I live in a pretty small rural village in Germany. Less than 200 people live there. not much around here besides fields, forests, cows, sheep, a donkey, and 2 horses. Directly outside of the house I live in is a road to the right, which leads into a field and then into a pretty thick forest. The route I usually take is around 18 kilometers long, or 11 miles for the US readers. I will simply stick to miles, to keep it simple. It doesn't sound like much, but the route is very rough. It's uphill almost the entire time, and the forest has no roads, so you actually walk through the rough terrain with thick tree roots and bushes, etc. Anyway, I walk this exact route 1 to 2 times per week, and usually when it's already dark outside. I wear a headlamp for when it's too cloudy out, and the moon isn't nicely visible, so I don't trip or get hurt. Why at evening or night? Because I'm usually on the phone with a good friend talking. We live very far apart. It's day for her when it's night for me. I don't mind, because that way I don't feel alone hiking. Info dump, because I deem it important. For people who are not familiar with German forests, the most dangerous thing you may encounter is a wild boar, so it's usually pretty safe to just wander around. Almost no wolves where I am, and even if, they would be way too shy to just show themselves. Bears are not a thing here. Also no crazy people living inside the forest. The only thing you encounter is the farmer who drives up like 1 to 2 miles into the road to check on his livestock. After that, it's all forests, no fields anymore. Anyway, now to the weird thing I experienced. Headlamp on, AirPods in, talking to my friend, catching up. For the first 5 miles or so, nothing weird happened. I even had the headlamp off, though I wore it on my head, and the moon was making enough light, and once your eyes adjust to the dark, you can see quite well, as long as you don't sprint around the forest. Though once I was in the deeper part of the forest, my AirPods started making weird sounds, almost like I was losing connection, but I could hear her voice still. It was more like a background buzzing. It wasn't actually interfering with my call. This buzzing went on, and after about 20 minutes or so, I suddenly noticed that I couldn't see as well anymore as I could. The moon was blocked by clouds, but these clouds didn't look like normal clouds. They looked like thick walls of fog, just way higher up than fog should be. I know it's hard to picture, but clouds usually look fluffy or thinned out. These seemed heavy and wet. It's hard to describe. I told my friend to hold on for a minute, because I had to focus on something. I don't know why I said that, but focusing on her talk was disrupting my view for whatever reason. Sensory overload, I guess. The thing I had to focus on was a huge, thick, deep black cloud. It kind of pushed itself through the fog like clouds and positioned itself right over me, almost as if it was trying to throw a shadow around an area I was in. The cloud also started to swirl in the middle slightly, and that was when my connection just fell flat. I got the beeping sounds you get when you lose connection, and gone was my phone call. No more bars, no mobile data, nothing. But my AirPods were still buzzing like crazy in my ears. That's when I felt uneasy. Neck hair standing up, cold sweats on my back, and I started turning around to leave because the way ahead just seemed a lot more dark and sinister than my way back. The moment I turned around and started, well, slightly jogging back because I felt scared, was when I started to hear bell sounds. Almost like church bells, but the sound was deeper. That typical ring you hear after a bell sound was just stuck in the air, and it was giving me this weird sensation as if my bones were suddenly rubbing against each other. It was extremely freaky. All I remember is that I started to go from walking back to jogging back to running back, trying to leave the forest and go back to the fields where you start. I didn't look back while running, but I could hear the bell sound getting weaker the further away I got, and the fog-like clouds were becoming less and less until I finally left the forest and I was back to normal sky, thin clouds, and the moon. Once I got back home, I simply undressed, went into the shower, and went to bed, thinking I just simply got spooked today. Or maybe I was exhausted and my brain went haywire. I don't know. But I never saw a cloud like that in my life, and church bells are not a thing late at night inside a forest. Never went back to hike that route. Never told anyone, because I'm a bit embarrassed, but I had to think of it today. A bit long, but I know you all like a good account. As a student in the late 90s, I was asked to take part in the last UK university's pistol shooting competition at Bisley Camp, home of Britain's largest competitive shooting complex. I wasn't keen on it, as the Dunblane massacre had put a grim slant on things and pistols were about to be permanently banned. With peer pressure, I agreed to go along. A minibus would take the team up. We'd have the competition, come home, go to the pub for a laugh. The night before the competition, I had a crystal clear dream of a white Ford Capri and a horrible accident. A row of 4 orange leaf trees, a broken axle, a Scottish woman with a small black dog asking if I was alright. I woke up that morning to be told our minibus booking had fallen through, and some guy called Luke would drive the 4 of us. I didn't know the guy, had never met him, never heard of him, knew nothing about him or his car, and had never been to Bisley. Luke was just a friend of a team member doing us a favor, yet he was wearing the red jacket, black jeans, and blue baseball cap of the person I'd seen in my dream. When he turned up at our halls of residence in a white 2-door Ford Capri, both I and the friend I'd told the dream about essentially went pale and refused to get into the car. Guys, you're being ridiculous. I had it serviced last month. It's old, but it's fine. Nah, man. The front axle of that car is... What? The axle is fine. Upset because we were late, he gets in and throws the car up and down the driveway, jamming on the brakes, then shouts, "See? Get in. We're late." The day goes fine. Competition ends. All in high spirits. Get in the car and idiot Luke decides to speed up the main road out of the camp. Just as I yell, "Stop the car, I'm getting out," there's an almighty pop followed by screeching as the car veers left into a row of 4 orange leaf trees and comes to a halt. Lots of panic shouting and cursing. We get out and, yep, the axle has snapped. A crowd gathers due to the noise. As I'm standing there freaked out by it all, a small woman I somehow recognize walks up and, yep, asks me if I'm alright. She has a Scottish accent and is walking a small black terrier. When the AA man turns up, he tells us that if this had happened at speed on the motorway, there's a good chance that we'd all be dead. We eventually got home via some ridiculous series of buses, and I sat eating in silence in the dining hall with my friend. Both of us too messed up to say anything. I described the whole thing to him that morning, and for several weeks afterward, he became quite distant, as though he mentally connected me with death itself. About a decade later, we caught up, and the event came up in conversation. He found it much harder to talk about, but his comment always stuck with me. He said that when I told him and what occurred that morning, had forced him to see life in very different terms. Essentially, he'd had to face up to the possibility that there was more to this life than he was willing to consider, and that it frightened him. He'd even had a few nightmares about it over the ensuing years. As he said, the sheer size of it all and what it meant has always scared me since then. I'm in my 40s now, and I find myself thinking about it every so often. I still, well over 20 years later, find it very hard to describe what I truly feel. I just know that this life and this death are far larger than we can ever comprehend. To finish it all, a couple of years ago, I had to sit in the back seat of my brother's 2-door car on a quick journey. For the first time in my life, I had what I now know as a panic attack, and clearly linked to what I just described. It was horrific, and I will never sit in one of those ever again. Even thinking about it makes me slightly nauseous again. The stuff is buried very deep in our consciousness. Trust your dreams. Hi all. Thought I'd share something interesting that happened to me about 15 years ago. Most won't believe me, but for what it's worth, I promise everything I tell you is 100% true. and how it happened to the best of my memory. However, names have been changed. I was about 18 and I was hanging out at my friend Joanne's house with some other school friends. Can't quite remember how we got into the subject, but towards the end of the evening, Joanne thought it would be fun to perform a seance. Joanne's and her family were from Cape Town, South Africa. They had a deep-rooted interest in the spiritual, or at least that's what Joanne made out to us. With the lights off and candles lit, we all sat at a round table, with cards fanned out around the edge. Each card had a letter of the alphabet arranged, A to Z, and a shot glass placed in the middle. Joanne starts speaking out to the spirits in Afrikaans. I remember pulling a face and rolling my eyes. It was too dark for anyone to take offense. At the time, I was an insufferable, enlightened atheist teen dork. You know the type. Cringy 4chan edgelord who thinks any form of spirituality or religion is beneath me and my superior intellect. I never wore a fedora, but I was darn close. However, what was about to happen made me question everything. It started mundane enough. A few questions were asked, and the shot glass we were resting our fingers on started to move to and fro, until eventually one of my friends asked the spirit if they were associated with anyone in the room. The shot glass moved directly towards me. Incredulous, I asked the spirit, "If you're associated with me, then what's my mother's maiden name?" My eyes fixate on the letters that spell out her maiden name, Jones, but the glass started spelling out something different. First the glass went to T, then H, then O. I thought then it was BS, as it was completely wrong. Then I was struck by a horrific realization. When my mom was 6 months old, her biological father died of a heart attack, and a year after that, she took her stepfather's name. I completely forgot this in the moment, as I was expecting the glass to read out the maiden name she had for the majority of her life, but it was actually spelling out her original maiden name of Thompson. It was a fact so trivial that I barely remembered it myself. It was something never talked about, even within my family, as it happened so long ago. It would be hard to believe that any of my friends would know this esoteric piece of my family's history that occurred 20 years before I was even born, but nonetheless, somehow it was being spelled out in front of my very eyes. Thompson. My school friends and I wouldn't talk about anything deeper than video games and tits at that age, yet there's no way I ever mentioned this to any of them. It's not like one of my pot-smoking loser friends had a copy of my mom's birth certificate, and none of them had ever met anyone else in my family. There was literally no way anyone could have known this. Before I could contemplate this for too long or ask any other questions to my ghostly associate, Joanne's mom came into the room and turned the lights on, and with a thick South African accent souched something like, "Bloody hell, Joanne, stop messing around with this silly crap," and put a definite stop to the proceedings. Of course, at the time, I played it off as a prank, but the more I think of it, the more my mind wanders. Did something actually paranormal happen that night? I know it's nothing dramatic or exciting. I didn't see an apparition or a cryptid, but unlike 90% of the stuff you read on Reddit, this experience is actually true, and something to this day I can't explain. I'd love to hear your thoughts. TLDR. Very obscure information about my family history was divulged during a seance which none of the participants could have possibly known. I'm not one to believe in Bigfoot, the Yeti, or monsters, but ghosts, oh my. Ghosts are a whole other story. One day about 19 years ago, when I was around 4, I started seeing a woman. An imaginary friend, if you will. She was in her 80s probably. Her name, well, I think it was Megan. I cannot remember all this. It is all basis of what my parents remember. So, Megan, well, she was all around an amazing friend. She told me stories of her as a child, of her sons and her husband. I loved hearing her stories. She told the greatest ones. Whenever I was cold, I would say, "Maggie, I'm cold." Then I would be warm. My parents were at first frightened, but then learned to accept her as a positive in our lives. So on with the story. After a while of talking to her, I grew in intellect and got the idea to ask what her sons' names were. Tommy, Max, and I cannot remember the last. I started telling my parents what she had told me. They knew I was not making anything up, because my little 4-year-old mind could not conjure up such thoughts. Then out of nowhere, she just disappeared. I stopped talking of her and cries whenever she was mentioned, but I started seeing something else. Me and the spirit never were in direct contact, but I have had some scary experiences. Like one late October night, me and my dad were putting out Halloween decor. Once we put down all the gravestones, we both heard, "Why? Why? Shh, do not talk." And we heard this clear as day. That was my only real experience with him. The voice was clearly male, my dad said. When I was around 8, we moved to a larger house, a house of horrors. On the 4th day of us being there, now this I remember. Oh yes, I remember. It was early in the morning and I went downstairs to get some crackers to see if my new pet parrot would eat them. I got up to my room and fed my parent. He actually ate them, nibble by nibble. When he was done, he spat the words, "Lord, oh Lord," sat in the chair. "I am aware. Take me now, and I praise." Then, well, let's just say Polly had no more crackers ever since. 8 years later, when I was 13, I asked my dad what he thought of the event. Then he informed me of the strange experiences I had as a child. I was stunned, very, very creeped out, but in some ways touched. I asked him, "Do you remember the names of the 3 kids of Megan?" Thankfully, yes, he did. Sadly, though, over the years since then, I've forgotten the 3rd, and my dad, well, he did too. My mom, well, she remembers nothing of the sorts. She was always out of town for work. So we found and contacted Tommy. We arranged a meeting at his house. We engaged in small talk. Then I told him more about my experiences with Megan. For a moment, he was speechless, stunned even. Very, very much so. A few moments later, he said, "Megan was my mom's name." He showed us old photos of him and his mom. I instantly felt a feeling of remembrance. I said, "That is her. That is Megan." You do not have to believe me on this, but on the back of one of the photos it said, in her handwriting, "Say hi to Mary for me." Yes, Mary is my name. Later that day, I went and visited her grave with her son Tommy, who by the way was around his mid-40s. I paid my respects, dropped off some flowers and stones. It is a tradition in my religion to put stones. Then I just started staring at the moon. Believe me or not, I think I saw her face in the sky. Here I am, today writing this story for you, in honor of Megan. I decided to add one of her own stories, the one that I can remember. Quotations. It was a long night, many years ago. I was young, very young. In fact, I was around 5. Me and my brother Hank were skipping stones in a pond when my dad came up and jumped into the pond. Not too long after him, a big shaggy dog came barreling in after him. Quotations ended. That was a summarized version of the time she got her first dog. I know this was not the scariest story, but I thought I would tell it, and maybe one day I will see Megan on the other side.